Hello and welcome, everybody. Great to see all these faces.
Cool. We can give it another minute.
Right.
Okay.
I am the de facto host today, but just
Wow,
to
something
give some
else.
intros to our special guests today, we have Jason, who is, I think, most apt to talk about progress for sure, with his role as a kind of technology historian and founding of the nonprofit Roots of Progress. He is a consultant to the Oxford University program, Our World in Data, and he comes from a background in tech, but I think it's pretty impressive how you've made it kind of your life mission to keep talking about progress in whatever context that means, tech, industry, all of the above. And then we have Ben from the Tony Blair Institute, the team I come from, who runs our science and innovation team, which inherently is focused on progress, with innovation being at the forefront of a lot of their work. He authors our aptly named Substack Progress. So you guys can subscribe to that if you're interested in some of the things he talks about today. But I think it's pretty impressive to say both of these guys, whether it's progressing in their own careers or progressing just kind of in the philosophical ways of how we're getting there today and what the means of this discussion is, I think they're both perfect people to kick off. So I'm sure a lot of you have been on InterIntellect before, and for those that haven't, we'll kind of let them start off the conversation, but it really is meant to be a two-way street. If anyone has any thoughts, please chime in, share where you're coming from today, and why progress is important to you in whatever context. Again, I think that's the beauty of this space. So my name's Liz, community manager for the Tony Blair Institute, and I'm coming from San Jose today. And for me, progress is really important, especially in a political context. That's why I work in tech policy. So very excited to be with all of you guys today. And just a heads up, we are recording the conversation, but that's more for InterIntellect's kind of records. So thanks, everyone. I'll hand it over to Jason and Ben. I think it could be helpful to kick off kind of addressing the conversation, the topic of the session, like what is progress? What is the context? It means so many different things. Ben, we know from just a US and UK context, progress in the US is very forward thinking, where progress in the UK is maybe a little more mild. So I'd love to hand that over to you guys to address. Thanks.
Super. Do you want me to jump in then, Jason? Great. Thank you very much, Liz. And just to reiterate sort of the message that Liz said about making this quite an open forum for discussion, I think, in the spirit of the salons, it's great to hear lots of different perspectives and to sort of build new coalitions as well, in particular about how we are coming from progress from sort of multiple different angles. And I think Liz is right in sort of our primary sort of focus in the way that we think about progress is really around sort of the technological and government side, and actually how you sort of reform both government around technology and then stimulate the sort of the wider innovation network. And when we sort of break that down, and part of the discussion that sort of Jason and I had sort of prior to this and thinking about this is that in terms of how this sort of the conditions for progress manifest themselves, people can sort of sometimes go very much down sort of one element, which is we're seeing breakthroughs in biology, or we're seeing breakthroughs in computing power, whereas it's kind of a wider ecosystem approach, which is both cultural, political, and technological, and having the confluence of those conditions meet is where I think you sort of see those compounding effects, I guess. And I think when we think about then the history of progress, I think you've had the huge paradigm shifts, which everyone here will be incredibly aware of, whether that's from sort of the Industrial Revolution, the Agrarian Revolution, or more sort of, I guess, cultural based elements such as the Enlightenment and whatnot. But I think why we're really thinking about this today again is because I think what you are seeing is a confluence of lots of conditions again today, and I think some of those are technological and some of those are political. And I'd say the word we're lacking a little bit is somewhere on the government side right now, that seems to be a bit in an anti-technology and progress space in many jurisdictions. So I think one of the reasons that we want to sort of kickstart this conversation and really sort of think about progress is, how do we build that new coalition today? How do we sort of make sure you get those compounding effects of all the different people thinking about it from the sort of the different perspectives that need to happen? And then sort of just really, in my mind, how do you sort of unleash what I think would be another paradigm shift in society if we get it right? And I think particularly when I look at elements like healthcare today and some of the breakthroughs we're seeing in, whether that's sort of DeepMind in with AlphaFold and other bits, or even in energy, where I think sort of the conversation has been accelerated because of the energy crisis right now, but we're on the sort of the cusp of reasonably major breakthroughs, I think, in sort of a number of areas, which, if we think about sort of even the Industrial Revolution, in some ways the long-term effect of that was where we are with energy today. And if we get another sort of shift in energy to abundance today, the long tail of that in and of itself is going to be, a huge multiplier effect for society, which I don't think we can even begin to think of over the next sort of 10, 20, 50 years even, because it completely changes the locus of how society operates in and of itself. So that's a reasonably big intro to how we think about progress and why we're excited by it, and why we focus on it. But so with that in mind, I'll sort of let Jason also offer some thoughts.
Yeah, sure. Before I dive into the thoughts, maybe just to briefly discuss points of order, I'll suggest, Benedict, let me know what you think, that we should just have people use the raise hand feature if they want to talk, since we have so many folks here. And Benedict, I'll just let you be the sort of host or MC, and you can call on people. The other thing I would suggest is if people have very quick reactions or things, feel free to share them in the chat. I have a hard time listening to people and reading the chat at the same time, so I kind of prefer that there aren't super long discussions going on in chat, although that sort of inevitably happens. But feel free to use it for quick kind of reactions and sharing links and stuff like that. Benedict, Liz, does that sound good to you?
Sounds perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. So some thoughts. Well, I have tons of thoughts on all these issues. Let me just concentrate on kind of one thing that I think will be most relevant, which is my kind of top hypotheses around what are the most relevant factors in today's context for progress, and why might progress have slowed down over the last 50 years or so, so-called technological stagnation, and then also kind of what might we want to focus on in order to think about preserving the pace and even accelerating it. Those are all sort of the same. I have the same sort of three basic answers for all those. And my three basic answers are, or hypotheses at least, are one, the regulatory framework, two, the way that we fund, organize, and manage research and development, especially science, and then number three, fundamental cultural attitudes around progress, the belief in progress or the idea of progress itself. So just elaborate on each of those a little bit. The regulatory framework, I think a number of areas of progress today are facing a sort of overburden or a burden of overregulation. In the United States, at least, I don't know how this plays out in UK. Some of you folks can comment, but in the US, we've created something of a vetocracy. We have created an environment where we've given a lot of power, both sort of regulatory and procedural power, to people who want to slow things down, overall to people who are kind of have an obstructionist mindset or approach. And so, for instance, I live for the last over a decade, I've lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, and you basically just can't build anything or start a business in San Francisco, kind of very famously, because everybody who wants to stop you for any reason, whatsoever, can sort of come in and make you go through all kinds of reviews, community hearings, file all sorts of things against you, et cetera. And then more broadly, of course, I mean, there are many more examples of this. Nuclear power was essentially strangled by a kind of, very turbulent and rapidly escalating regulatory environment in the late 60s and early 70s, et cetera, et cetera. I could go on. Okay, number two, the organization and management of science. We've got a few folks on the call today, I see, who specialize in this sort of thing. Eric Gilliam has been writing a lot about this. Ben Reinhardt is actually working on new ways of structuring research for learning the lessons from the United States' DARPA. And so, but we've ever since World War II, we've grown up a large centralized federal bureaucracy. Oh, Stewart, of course, has made this also the center of his work. But ever since World War II, we've grown up this large centralized bureaucracy for funding research. A lot of the funding has gotten concentrated into a small number of large agencies in the US. These are like the NIH, National Institute of Health, the NSF, the National Science Foundation. And these organizations give out grants through a kind of committee-based peer review process that, almost seems designed to foster groupthink and, maintaining the consensus of a status quo, when of course what we need for scientific progress is sort of, mavericks who are going to challenge the status quo and bring in new concepts and new paradigms. And even if they weren't, even if we didn't have maybe, processes like this that kind of lend themselves to groupthink, I think there would still be a problem with simply the fact of so much centralization, because anytime you have a single sort of centralized pathway for science funding to go through, you have the chance of blind spots. There's almost guaranteed to be some blind spots. In Silicon Valley, if you're a startup and you want to raise money from VC, you can go to, any of a dozen different like top, very highly regarded VCs to get money, and 11 of them can say no to you as long as one says yes. But you don't really have the same situation in science funding today. And so then, number three, underlying a lot of this, I think, is fundamental cultural attitudes towards progress. And this is a thing that I've written about and documented. The belief in progress. Is progress possible? Is progress desirable? This was really, I think, a fundamental cultural shift that happened around sort of the 17th century that led to the scientific and ultimately to the Industrial Revolution. It's not the only thing that led to that, but it was a key shift. And it's something where, going into the 20th century, the world, at least the West, was gung-ho about progress and was extremely optimistic about the future, and saw the future as even through, I would say, 30s, 40s, 50s, even through the 1960s in the US, people saw the future as a time that would be better than the present. They thought living standards would continue to improve, technology was going to come along and solve problems and make the world better. And really ever since, in some ways, since the World Wars, and certainly since the 1970s, people have not seen technology in such an optimistic light. And in fact, we've grown quite fatalistic and defeatist. And I think we've completely lost a bold, ambitious vision of a technological future. And that's something that we really need to bring back. Okay, I could go on for a long time about this, but I'll draw a line there, and I would love to hear thoughts from others.
So we've got some claps from Tom, I see. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts on that? Otherwise, I'm sort of happy to sort of build off that again a bit, but because it's touched on a lot of thoughts where Jason and I probably have too much alignment to make this sort of a probing disagreement. But
let me just say, by the way, there's a lot of people in the audience who are doing really great work that is relevant to this. I hereby give you permission to talk about your own work and plug it just slightly, just briefly at least. I think I would love for the rest of the world, and especially the rest of this audience, to hear about the stuff that some of you all are doing, because I'm excited about it.
Yeah, it's a great point. So Josh, please come in.
Yes. So I asked this in the chat. My question is the regulatory issue separate from the attitude? Like how much, I do think, Jason, having been to some of your lectures, there is some difference in attitude of people. But I think that among sort of the lay person, fearing technology is sort of an old meme that has existed, and that really what's changed isn't that people are more afraid of technology now, but that they have the means to sort of act on it via regulation. Whereas, before, maybe people didn't like it, maybe people didn't like coal or trains or were afraid of all these things, but they really couldn't stop it. And so what the mass of people thought wasn't really important. What mattered was the elites who controlled the political system. So I'm kind of curious if you've given that any thought.
Yeah, great question and good point. So I do think that the fundamental sort of attitudes toward technology are pretty are one of the things that's kind of driving the regulatory environment. However, at the same time, I think you're absolutely right that people have always been, new developments in technology have always been opposed and fought and were usually feared. And there were always worries and concerns. I think what changed was just something in kind of the balance. For a long time, especially towards the end of the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century, it was widely seen that that new inventions and new technology were making our lives better. You had things like the Transcontinental Railroad in the U.S. getting completed in 1869. That links, the coasts, and suddenly, a trip that used to take 6 months can be done in 6 days. You had the telephone, the light bulb, all of these things they're coming into people's lives, into their very homes, into their workplace. And so people can just sort of see very concretely in front of their face kind of how technology is solving problems and making things better. And I think it led to overall a very optimistic outlook. After the world wars and after the rise of the counterculture and the environmentalist movement, you just got this, not only were people kind of maybe wary about individual new developments in technology on a kind of one-off basis, but there arose this entire philosophy of how technology and technological systems were actually harming people's lives, and even go further than that, we're sort of like suppressing the freedom of the individual. Tanner, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, because I think you've studied this even more than I have, but I'm just coming to see how much in the early 20th century, a very technocratic worldview and way of running government and managing technological systems arose, and how much the counterculture was a reaction to this from the idea that these large technological systems that were managed top down were actually oppressive and limiting to the freedom and the creativity and the lives of the individual. It's this paradox, or it's this seeming contradiction between these things, and I think ultimately a false dichotomy, but something that really was I think one of the major issues of the 20th century. And so by the 70s, you just had people wanting to reject all of this, and that you can see the direct link between the culture and the regulation. In 1971, there was this court case that I'll give a hat tip to Eli Dorado for pointing me to. It was a court case just after the new environmental law, National Environmental Protection Act, NEPA, and it was about a nuclear plant where the Atomic Energy Commission, which was then the nuclear regulator, didn't want to do environmental review or require environmental review on this one nuclear plant. And this court basically came along and said, or somebody sued, and the court said, yeah, actually NEPA says you have to do environmental review even if there are no kind of known issues from the start. And the opening of this court case says, sort of is setting the wider context, and it says something like, we foresee a flood of new litigation because several recently enacted statutes attest to the commitment of the government to protect, I forget, the public or the environment or something. And it was specifically this line about to slow down at long last the harmful engine, the destructive engine of material progress, with progress in scare quotes, right? So fundamentally, if society sees material progress as a destructive engine, you're going to get a vetocracy, set up in order to try to slow that engine down or stop it. So I do think those things are super connected.
It's super interesting. One thing just to quickly sort of add before I see Peter and Max have also got their hands up. I mean, probably sort of in terms of the opposite trend in your thesis is that, while you've seen the sort of centralization in some elements, you've seen the decentralization of the media and the ecosystem. So whereas the elite sort of had the control of the media and could probably build out those grand narratives, the vetocracy probably also has been a sort of a unintended or function, I guess, of the decentralization of the media, which allows much more people into the debate and to be able to sort of oppose on particular grounds as well, which ultimately then makes your political system probably more risk averse, because it allows for sort of, I guess, greater opposition, particularly around singular or sort of particular ideas, which probably means sort of a bit of that stagnation and stasis happens within the system as a result of that. But that's probably a whole thesis on itself. So I'm going to hand over to Peter as well to jump in.
Okay, hello everyone. Thanks all. Yeah, I guess just in the spirit of sort of opening remarks, I liked what you were both sort of saying about conditions for progress, and then the questions you had. I guess the one thing I want to just throw in is that the classic, okay, well, what do you mean by progress? And the quick sort of comment you might say is just like change in a good direction. And then, of course, you have to say something about what we take, what we mean by good or bad. This quote, the destructive engine of material progress, is very evocative, and I guess it's interesting to think like into the mindset of somebody who would say something like that. You know, what kinds of progress are they more interested in, and why are they seeing this thing they're pointing out with the words material progress as a threat to that? I guess it really, this sort of question about like how do we think about, you know, what we actually want is like pretty bound up with what Jason was sort of listing as his third kind of area of interest, namely the cultural attitudes. And I kind of shared with the first questioner like a pretty deep interest in this question of like why like cultural attitudes have changed since the Second World War, apparently. And I liked some of the things that Jason pointed out, but I think there's probably more to be said there, and I hope we get a chance to dive into that a bit today.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, particularly on that sort of cultural. I mean, Jason, I don't know if you have any further thoughts you want to expand that, or if anyone else wants to come in on their views on what the cultural changes have actually happened, because I do think it's a huge component of what we see happening today. And I think, you know, Jason alluded to a couple of these points, and, you know, if you do any sort of polling today, people think they're going to be, or their children are going to be worse off than the generations before them. And, you know, if you actually think about the way that the majority of people live, they live like, you know, essentially kings in comparison to previous generations before. And to see that sort of belief that we are essentially going backwards, where probably in many elements we feel like we could signify that we're going forwards, is a pretty interesting dissonance, or at least something that we need to unpack, I think, from a sort of a social level. And I think sometimes that's where the political discussion gets a bit unstuck, because it kind of goes with the flow of what they feel is the public sentiment, rather than tries to lead it to a sort of a new form of optimism, I guess, in that sense. But if anyone has any thoughts, particularly on that question, please do jump in.
Yeah, I have, just thinking about this, cultural attitudes kind of theory. I think it would be a good idea to test this on other cultures, for example. And I'm definitely an Anglophone, so I'm not nearly as well informed as one could be on this issue. But for example, you think about like China, and they put out these political statements where material progress, technological progress is seen as like extremely important and desirable, and the key to, the supremacy of the Chinese state so I wonder what effect that has on technological progress there. There's definitely a lot, it's a little different. And then I remember seeing this survey of, I think it's like gene editing, or at least embryo selection, and people's attitudes towards making their children smarter using this technology. And India was like a huge outlier in approval of this kind of thing. So I think it's important to try and break out of the US, UK sphere and test the cultural attitudes hypothesis on other cultures.
So I really agree with that, and just to add a couple of my thoughts on that again, which is, you look at a lot of the sort of survey data from around the world. If you look at sort of attitudes to globalization, for every country that's sort of in the ascendancy and growing, everyone is completely in favor of this. Whereas then you look at countries, particularly France is always incredibly maudlin about such affairs, the UK and Germany. And I'm always struck by, I remember a quote from a Chinese official, probably about 5 years ago, in one of Danny Roderick's pieces, which said, we treated globalization like a mosquito net. We let the good things in, the fresh air in, but we get the bad things out as well. And so had a very particular view of how to manage that. So I think that's absolutely right. And particularly, we work in 30 African countries, and there's a very, very different view to sort of progress and how you move up that development curve very, very quickly. But Jason, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that particular question as well.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I certainly think that, if you point to China as a place where people are more positive about the potential for industrial development to make people's lives better, it is also one of the places that is growing faster, right? And I think there's a reinforcing relationship between those two things, right? So in a place where there is a lot of recent economic growth within living memory, people are going to be more optimistic. If people feel like they have seen their own lives get better, or they can see the difference between their parents' lives and their lives, then they're more optimistic about that continuing for the future. And conversely, when people believe that that is possible, they work to make it happen, and then it can happen. Similarly, when people don't see that, then they stop. They just wonder, hey, what is the point of all of this? Progress isn't even happening, or if it's happening, it's not making our lives better, so why bother? And conversely, if they decide not to bother with it, then it won't happen. So I think there's a lot of inertia. There's a reinforcing cycle for good or bad in these things. That doesn't mean it can't change, just means that some other factor needs to, it can easily get stuck in an attractor, point. And something else has to come along, to change that.
Yeah, and just hopefully I'm getting this right in terms of order, but I can't see your name, but DSR 26, I think you were next as well.
Cheers. Yeah, hi, it's Diana. So hi everybody, and guys and Liz. Thanks for the really cool intros. I think on that kind of cultural point, just a few thoughts. So my background is in international development, so a study of kind of socioeconomic development from different from kind of economic and social and anthropological point of view. And I currently work in responsible innovation, so quite big on the whole tech-enabled progress, what's right, what's wrong. And it's kind of interesting when you talk about culture and the third point from a kind of very maybe objective kind of attitude perspective. How do people think about how optimistic is someone? Because I think kind of going back in history and kind of trying to explain what worked for certain countries at different stages, oftentimes you go back to that point around religion and kind of, does certain Confucianism or certain Protestant ethic feature in kind of economic progress of a specific country. And I think it's really interesting because like lots of times, you would say the argument is no, but mentality is really, really sticky, and it's the last thing to change. But then you've seen how tech specifically and certain economic change, if you look at Asian tiger, for example, any Asian tiger, if you look at kind of South Korea, how that inevitably changed culture and attitudes, and for better or for worse, you can have an argument there. So I'm kind of like, in my head, I'm thinking, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, how do you change that attitude? How do you make people more optimistic without any kind of underlining significant technological or economic change? And then the second question is, I guess, around how do people feel about, that kind of cultural point as a driver of progress in general? And as the West, are we just all kind of, have we all just gone wrong at a certain point and are just like valuing wrong things? Anyways, that's a bigger question, but just a few comments, hopefully not too broad.
Absolutely not. Jason, do you have a stab at the first question? I mean, one of the things I always notice in the political debates is that, it's very hard to ignite it sort of out of nothing. So what it quite often is almost a kind of a, China is doing X on technology, so we need to do Y, right? Rather than a sort of a bottom-up approach. It kind of almost has to create the opposition to inspire the optimism. But Jason, I know you've done some thinking on this, so jump in.
Yeah, just to try to keep things brief, because I'd love to hear from everybody else who's got hands up. I mean, so the question of sort of what led to economic growth in other, parts of the world, especially in Asia, is sort of different from what led to the initiation of say the Industrial Revolution in Britain, right? Probably, I'll throw out a book recommendation on this. There's a book that came out quite recently called How the World Became Rich. That is a pretty good summary of sort of what academia knows about this, like the academic literature on this and in economic history. I do think that sort of, philosophical and cultural attitudes and beliefs are highly relevant to overall progress. I'm a little skeptical about pinning things too much on any one religion. except to the extent that certain religions, as interpreted and implemented certain ways at certain times and places, happen to have certain things that were more or less relevant for progress, like their usury laws or the way they approached education or whatever. I think this book that I just mentioned goes into the idea that Protestantism had something to do with the Industrial Revolution, and basically, if I recall, it says that like all the effects of Protestantism go away if you just control for education. And so maybe it was just that like the Protestants educated their kids more or promoted the value of education, and like that's all it really was about. So recommend checking out that book if you want to understand better, sort of, especially like, yeah, why did it happen in different places and different times, and what were the factors that led to the initiation of growth here versus there in the world, etc.
Thanks, guys.
Great point. So Dan, I think.
Yeah, I'll just give a couple thoughts. I agree with what's been said. I think there's sort of a bidirectional relation between like progress and culture, because like Jason said, there's this feedback loop where when people start seeing a lot of material progress and their lives improving, they get really optimistic about technology. And you see this in like other people are just saying, developing countries like China, Africa, India, they're really excited about technology. And I think a lot of that's because they're seeing the huge, increases in standard of living happening all around them. And then of course with the Chinese government, they are also, kind of in the pushing technology forward to the other thing I was going to say was, yeah, there's this idea from like Tyler Cowen that countries kind of eat all the low-hanging fruit and then kind of plateau, and we're sort of in that plateau right now. And I also think there's another idea from like J. Storrs Hall that like when there's no like really pressing concerns, like say foreign aggressor, like we experienced during World War II or the Cold War, people tend to look more at they tend to create problems where there's, or maybe not problems. Anyway, it's a bit of a complicated argument, but basically J. Storrs Hall thinks that sort of occurred where people are basically getting up in arms about problems that aren't actually as big as they think. And a lot of that's around technology and concerns about how it's affecting society, the environment, things like that. So yeah, it would be interesting to do like cross-cultural studies on the progression of techno-optimism and see if there's any general trends. Like maybe initially like techno-optimism and kind of increases and then it sort of plateaus and goes down. The other thing I was just going to throw out there was I think it was Trey. I don't know if he's here anymore. No. Peter Hartree was talking about how you define progress. I just wanted to say, like, I like to define it very abstractly as like problem solving. Because I think when you try to like, and I think you have to define it in like a very abstract way in order to like capture all the things we mean by it.
Awesome. I mean,
let me just break in real quick to say I want to invite relevant to one of Dan's first comments. I want to invite Ben Reinhardt to jump in at some point if you can, Ben, and share your thoughts about the importance of the frontier, because I know you have some thoughts on that.
I mean, I do. A bit on the spot, but like the thesis is basically that I mean, like if any of you are familiar with I'm forgetting his names, the frontier thesis from the early 20th century, and it's like effectively I buy that in the sense of like a frontier enables non-zero sum games. It allows us to like compete with nature and not ourselves. And so I think that's I guess not quite. It's a little bit tangential to the discussion, but I'll like throw that in as something in the mix.
Great. Super interesting. One quick, I mean, hand over to I think, Adrian. But one of the things I think Dan touched on, and sort of thinking about some of the philosophy of progress as well, which is just a quick reflection for sort of hand over to someone else, which is I think with a lot of the discussions where you see, I mean, if you think about some of like civilizational decline before, like the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, and you know, societies that got sort of so decadent and sort of bloated that they stopped caring about the next frontier, I guess, as well, which I guess is Ross Douthat, sort of the My Times kind of thesis as well, which I think it does mean you explore other vectors as well. And I think that's where, you know, even if you look at things like GDP today, where some of the questioning whether it's the right metric and thinking about whether you add in something like happiness, or like, you know, whether we're too sort of narrow in our definitions of progress. I mean, I think it's kind of a big philosophical debate about what is the kind of, I guess, the marginal improvements or the sort of the shifts that actually really change the dial for how people live, and how do we effectively measure those, is kind of a big question, I think, in terms of where we are today. And I mean, I can offer thoughts on where I think some of this is very naive, particularly degrowth, but I do think it's sort of a big question, and when we think about progress and think of it in the rounds. But I'll leave that as a sort of just a broad reflection from Dan. Otherwise, I think it's Adrian.
Yeah, thanks. I think I'm principally intrigued by how the progress movement might navigate the landscape of politics, and in particular of political identification. I think in someone's opening remarks, you mentioned that one of the main ambitions was to form coalitions. You know, I guess the progress movement is already a coalition. That's probably how it got going. But you know, you want to expand it and kind of develop these archipelagos or a graph or whatever. And I think that's going to force you into the landscape, which is, of course, looks especially contested just now. And I think one thing about the progress movement, which is not a bad thing, but it gives the impression of a group of people who are kind of hoping to achieve some very ambitious ends, almost despite politics, which is perhaps no bad thing in itself. But you can never escape the landscape. You're kind of, particularly if you're worried about things like regulation, I guess. You're going to be in that landscape where other people are going to position you with regard to pursuing certain norms or substantive ends that they'll care about one way or another. And I think one of the things the progress movement tries to do, there's this sort of implicit idea that you can kind of pivot past politics by saying, well, look, let's just find a way of establishing some kind of, you know, some cornucopia or some superabundance in some particular area that no one's really going to seriously disagree with, right? Like let's get fusion going, or let's fix cancer, or just make it just impossible for anyone to starve. There's so much damn food, you can't have a shitty enough politics that you'll go hungry, right? But even those things, if you think about it, the technological paths to those sorts of outcomes, where you try and force your way past, kind of shoulder past the agenda, they tend to happen upon areas where people do have all sorts of ideas about the effect of those things on society, but also the ethics involved in those particular technologies. I think there's also probably the suspicion that the default political assumption or identification of the progress movement is some kind of classical libertarian group of people, and maybe some kind of just centrists plus technology. That's my sense, but I'm far more interested in hearing what you guys think. How do you navigate this landscape without being put in it and immediately contested and ending up in the same old fights?
Yeah, I'll offer one quick reflection on that, and then Jason, you please come in, so I'm not speaking too much. But the one thing that I've noticed within, I think some of the kind of let's say, despair with how politics is working today means that I think people are often coming at this question from quite different angles. So whether that's sort of like your Ezra Klein supply side progressivism, Derek Thompson with the abundance agenda, or as you say, some where you think from sort of the libertarian side as well, I think there's a sort of a growing coalition of people, and whether they're sort of technology adjacent, I actually think quite often these people are just kind of, or even if you take housing supply as an issue, I think it's another sort of area where people are just kind of feel that there's this huge stasis within the political system. And so going back to sort of Jason's opening points, and are kind of just, I guess, fed up with that. And so the way that I see it is that actually it's kind of a manifestation of a broader kind of malaise in society. And I think how you fold that into or influence politics is an interesting question. But I think it is in many ways sort of apolitical, because I think people are coming to quite a similar conclusion from sort of starting from quite different points, actually. But Jason, please, I'd love to sort of hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think you can't be totally apolitical in that all these questions are obviously intimately bound up in philosophical, ideological, moral and social and political questions. I would like to, both personally and for the progress movement, to kind of rise a bit above like the day-to-day sort of political squabbles and tribalism of left and right politics today. And I am pleased that there are folks involved in the progress movement from not across the entire political spectrum, but certainly spanning the traditional kind of left-right divide, at least in the United States. There are plenty of libertarians interested in progress, and their prescription for progress is to get government out of the way. There are also plenty of progressives interested in politics, and they are calling, they would be more on the side of calling for more massive government investment in progress. Operation Warp Speed for everything, right? I think of them as like the Vannevar Bush, or the FDR wing of like the progress movement. Sorry, I'm being so America-centric here. It's just like where a lot of my stuff comes from. But there's got to be something, I don't know what the equivalent from UK is. But yeah, so I think that's good. And I think that progress, the concept and the ideal and the goal of progress can serve as a shared value and kind of a standard for us all to have some healthier political debates. I think it would be great if progressives and libertarians and everybody in between, and around got together and said, hey, okay, so we all agree that this kind of scientific, technological, and industrial progress, ultimately improving living standards for sort of, very broadly for people, all of that's our goal. How do we get more of that? And now we can all come to the table and we can all debate, okay, whose policies are actually going to achieve that? And we can all bring history and evidence and logic and data and so forth, and kind of have that kind of conversation. I think that would be great. I think that it would be much healthier than the debate that we have today, which is, a lot of which is centered around redistribution and identity politics, which I think is a very unhealthy debate to be having. So I would love it if, simply all the different kind of political factions within the progress movement were kind of like having that argument and that debate. What you don't see, I don't see a lot of in the progress movement are folks whose primary overriding concern is social justice or identity politics. I also don't see a lot of folks who are sort of like really strong social conservatives, right? So maybe some maybe some of those types of folks, you might think of those as kind of the extremes of either party. So maybe you think of progress as the progress movement as something that's more kind of on you might think of it as kind of the moderate center. I don't know. I don't think of myself as a moderate or a centrist, but I can see why you would think of it that way. But I think that what progress can do is sort of, let me put it this way. I don't think that quote, hey, everybody, let's be reasonable and not get too insane here, end quote, is not really a stirring political slogan. That is not what gets people to mount the ramparts and wage a crusade. And so I think it can be weak and vulnerable as a sort of political position. If your position is like, hey, let's take a nice, reasonable middle of the road, I think that is highly vulnerable to extremist, kind of idealists coming through. And I don't know, I myself am something of an idealist, but I want to uphold an ideal that's actually based in reason, science, and humanism. And human well-being and in history, and looking at what has actually created by far the most human well-being of anything in history, and that is the scientific and technological progress, and to some extent also the social progress that I think kind of goes along with Enlightenment values. But yeah, so that's why I come at it from a sort of Enlightenment or classical liberal kind of standpoint, because I think that's what actually has the backing of history. That is what has worked. That is what has actually created human well-being over the last few hundred years, much more so than anything over the thousands and tens of thousands of years before that. So I would like for the concept of progress to be a central concept around which the so-called moderate center can actually become crusading idealists, but hopefully on the grounds of reason. And therefore, without the horrors and the excesses of other idealistic movements we've seen in history.
Yeah, great. And Adrian points out that the UK equivalent is Harold Wilson, who was famous for making the white heat of technology speech, although we're going back some period there. So I hope we have some nearer term people that are thinking about that. I should probably plug our principal, but it's not the time for that. So Andrew, why don't you jump in?
Hey there. Yeah, I wanted to touch on the third point about cultural pessimism, sort of where does it come from, why do we have it? The thing that comes to mind is actually that we're possibly framing it backwards. So I like the way that, for example, when Thomas Sowell was talking in one of his books, can't remember, it might have been Knowledge and Decisions, where do crime and poverty come from? It's kind of the wrong question. Like, that's the default. The real question is, where does wealth come from, right? Like, how do we set up the conditions in order to produce that? So I see that there's some like deep kind of fundamental aspects of human nature that make pessimism a much easier default to get to, especially as you go up Maslow's hierarchy and you're no longer worried about getting food on your, getting your next meal. The marginal utility of every additional dollar and material progress decreases. So then a lot of the manifestations of these deep-seated like defects, if you want to call them, come out. So for example, like negativity bias, right? Like we all kind of overweight downsides versus equivalent upsides as a sort of biological phenomenon. Availability biases. We all have this unfortunate thing of hedonic adaptation. So we all just get used to whatever we have and then stop being happy from it, even though we're all so much better off than before. So it seems to me like kind of the narrative is really like, how do we set up conditions? Or the right approach here is like, how do you set up the conditions, which have to be very deliberate and intentional to kind of like sow and seed optimism, similar to like self-help advice of like, if you want to be happy, practice gratitude, kind of like symmetrical, right? Like you have to remind yourself to be grateful. That's kind of just like scaled up societally. So I think that's like really where art comes in also. Like if you look at what is the role of fiction, what is the role of movies, what is the role of like, what is the story being told? And I can't remember who said this earlier, but they brought up China as an example. There is one advantage that authoritarian governments have, which is propaganda. And that advantage means that they can tell a narrative and they can kind of force that narrative. Now, how much everybody believes it is unclear, obviously. But there is that kind of policy or sort of societal level advantage that they might have, despite all the downsides, obviously. And so that seems to be kind of like the question, I think, that we should all be thinking about how to answer, which is like, how do you generate the state of optimism rather than thinking, why don't we already have it? Things are obviously so much better off, right? Like everything's better. A couple other kind of points here is like, there's one particular chapter in David Deutsch's book, Beginning of Infinity, which like really stuck out in my mind when he was juxtaposing like prediction versus prophecy. So he was talking about like Malthus's prediction that like humanity is going to run out of food and we're all doomed, and like various different instances of that over time playing out. And I think there's just like that asymmetry of like, you can never predict when the new knowledge will come to be, which will then solve the problem. But it's always easy to look at a negative trend line and just extrapolate it. And then that asymmetry just plays out all the time because people are, attitudes towards climate change are in a sort of similar category right now, which is you're almost assuming a projection of trend line with like no new technology being built. So it's like one of the things that, what's his name? Bjorn Lomborg, like he's talking about like, why don't we just like spend money on innovation instead of just like creating a lot more of the technology we already have, right? So those are sort of just some thoughts of like, it seems like we should all be thinking about like, how do you create this state of optimism, and how do you like create institutions, and how do you create the kind of cultural changes to try to promote that, rather than looking at pessimism as a bug, kind of looking at it as like a default and something that you kind of like correct for. So.
One very brief comment in response to that. I think that's fundamentally right, and the analogy to sort of poverty being the default and wealth is created is a good one, except that in the 20th century, the trend reversed, right? So I think that's a good explanation for why weren't people optimistic about progress for like most of human history. But then things started going right, and people were actually very optimistic, at least in the West, certainly in the US. And then something went wrong in the 20th century. Something changed and in many ways reversed. And so I do think that needs kind of a special explanation in history and intellectual history and culture.
Yeah, and just to add, and sorry, Andrew, you jumping in there?
There was one thought on that. I had some notes here. I forgot to go through one of them. If you guys are cool.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, it was like that feedback loop between regulation and sort of cultural attitudes. So I think that there's just like people growing up today are just like absorbing a lot of what's implied by the regulatory system. So like cautionary principle, invisible costs are never seen. So like, what is the cost of the FDA being so cautious of all the new amazing drugs that like haven't come to be? And I think it was a recent podcast with Mark Andreessen, where he was talking about the like managerial state and sort of managerialism coming around. And it seemed like, as you said, Jason, like in the 40s or maybe it was the 50s, there did start to be this like transition to like a, how do you call it? Like it was like a managerial oligarchy, essentially, to where we have everything being run by managers rather than principals. And all the problems that come from that, and everyone's just getting used to lawyers running everything rather than like innovators. And so the risk tolerance kind of like significantly changed. So that might be contributing.
Yeah, so just a couple of quick reflections, and I'll pass over to Joe, I think, which is number one, I think you've also self-nominated yourself to one of the solutions there, Andrew, to writing the Progress Self-Help book. So we'll remember that as a takeaway from today. But I mean, secondly on that, and I think that's a really interesting point, because I think one of my reflections, particularly on COVID, which is it kind of very clearly demonstrated our ability to get technologies out at particularly rapid speed, like mRNA is a breakthrough, which is then accelerated incredibly quickly. Which I think when the public see that, and they see some of then the sort of, I guess, the lack, I mean, you see sort of a lot of the bioethics debates, which didn't seem to be really sort of thinking about moral philosophy in terms of like the grand challenges, right? And what that would actually mean in terms of sort of social utility outcomes. Whereas it was a very sort of cautionary principle to what you exactly said, which meant that you essentially got a stasis in something when you at any point you should be incredibly risk-taking to some degree, because the trade-offs at that point were far more significant than the ones that they were sort of implying around with the margins to some degree. So I think it's a really good example of where some of that aspects just really do not work in the current regulatory case. So I think there's a very live example that people will have long in their memory, I think, as well, from a sort of cultural standpoint. But Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I had some notes from earlier, but I've actually thrown them out the window because I thought a couple of things Andrew said were really interesting. I think like the best way to frame them is probably around like social value and like economic value as like a really like weak division. I think I think it's really interesting. Like, I have like a lot of young relatives, and my fiance is a primary school teacher, and I cannot tell you how many like 8 to 10-year-olds I've met who've told me that when they grow up, they want to be a mad scientist or an inventor or something like that. And if I compare that to my peers at university when I was 21, and how many of them actually went and like became those things versus, you know, the number of 8 to 10-year-olds who said they wanted to be a government bureaucrat versus the number who did that, which included me. Like, I think there's something quite interesting there, right? And I think like, we don't really like socially, I think this is one of the areas where like there is a bigger gap between America or the US and Britain, but we don't really socially value like building that much. I think it's seen as something which comes with like a lot of social risk, like in the UK system. I think people are still very like forced into like service jobs as like high status, high prestige jobs, in a way which is sort of, you know, you don't really get with like entrepreneurship, engineering, scientific discovery. I think there's also like a lot of like social prestige attached to like jobs which involve criticizing things rather than jobs which involve coming up with solutions, which is some of that sort of like managerial culture or like kind of consultancy culture. I may be kind of over assuming that because I'm now a consultant, but like I think we probably spend a bit too much time doing that. On the economic side, I thought this was actually coming back to something earlier, but like I think it's really interesting how we framed a lot of the kind of obstacles to progress as being about fear, when actually like I think in lots of cases they're actually just about like some quite like cold hard economic trade-offs, and particularly some like so house building or infrastructure building in the UK and in high zoning areas in the US, right, is like I think is a sort of awful kind of like prisoner's dilemma where people are very incentivized to like want to like retain like their kind of property values and the sense of what their community looks like. But if everyone does that, we end up with some really bad outcomes. And I think like I don't have a solution there, but I think you need to find ways to like buy people out of those structures. You need to find ways to just completely flip the incentives, because I don't think we're going to have any luck any other way. I think like people respond to economic incentives pretty hard, and in the last century that was kind of to their benefit, and it probably isn't for a lot of people now, including like people who have a say in things, you know, people who turn up to like local government planning meetings.
So I mean, there's quite a lot in that. Super interesting, Joe. And again, sort of another, you know, action point. We put a survey up to school children to find out how many mad scientists we want rather than bureaucrats. I think is a good indication of the world we're trying to build. I'd say there's one. I mean, the prestige, and I mean, I think this is definitely something that we feel more in the UK. And you know, I know we've talked about this before. I think Philip Tetlock's book on super forecasters is very good on this, and how we should hold some of the commentariat to account on their sort of critique and predictions. But I'm sort of conscious that we're sort of got about half an hour left now. Jason, I don't know if you have any reflections on any of those points, or if we want to sort of keep going around to make sure that everyone's had a say.
Got so many hands up, but I'd love to hear from people. So let's
agree. Cool. All right. So it was either Jorge or I think that's right.
Yeah, Jorge, right. So when I was surfing the web and I saw about this chat or this, and I wasn't quite sure exactly what it was about. And I'm just, you know, I've been studying or just looking at innovation for a long time. I'm also from the Bay Area, and yeah, I think there is another strain of thought in the United States that it's a lot less popular, but I think it's as valid. And I'm not going to get into it. I am in favor of progress, but you know, the reason I signed up for this is because I've been looking at innovation, and I think technology is a part of it, but I think it's a much bigger thing that also includes how the technology is implemented, which I think is part of this discussion, and is as equally important. But I guess I just signed up because in looking at this, I have this idea of what innovation is that I haven't actually ever like run across anywhere else. And I've really been looking for it as to anyone else that's kind of investigating this. And I thought this might be a good forum to just throw it out there and see like if you guys have heard anybody talk about it in this way. But you know, the more I look at it, the more I think that innovation is a force of nature, that we have this idea that somehow we're pushing it, but we're actually not, because no one's going to stop things from getting innovated. No one's going to stop technology from happening. I think that's something that it's been proven over and over again, and that nobody actually controls it. Like most of the ideas and most of the technologies and anything that gets invented is actually a combined effort of many different minds that go into something. And we kind of say, you know, like we kind of put a pin on somebody as saying, this guy's the guy that invented this. But then, you know, you have someone like Graham Bell who invented the telephone, but we say he invented the telephone because he made it to the patent office 2 hours before someone else that had exactly the same idea. So, you know, even if all of us here stop inventing stuff and everybody and MIT and Stanford stop inventing stuff, or, you know, those departments were gone, it wouldn't stop innovation from happening. It would just take a different flavor, but, you know, it will still happen. So my thing is like, we're not really, we're not the people that are creating process. If you're talking about innovations, we are in a way we're managing how that innovation happens. I think that kind of, I think that's the issue right now, is that many, you know, a lot of things have, progress has, as this been defined by this group, has had a lot of good effects, but I think there's obviously a lot of things that have not gone well. And I think that speaks more to the management of the innovation and how we look at it. And I just haven't heard anyone else talk about it in that way. So I was wondering, do you guys know of any like group or any like that kind of thought, you know?
I see Andrew has a sort of a comment, and so maybe he wants to jump in, but just one quick reflection is, I mean, I think one of the things that we are thinking about is the conditions in which progress can flourish, right? And I do think, you know, you say that something like, you know, MIT might keep inventing, but if you then take a sort of an A/B test between North Korea and South Korea, you can sort of say that the conditions in which you exist do matter for innovation to flourish, right? And so that it does need to have a sort of, you know, to your exact last point, which you have to think about those underlying conditions and what you're sort of trying to achieve, and then think about then those processes and the management and the diffusion of technologies, all of which then combine all your regulatory and political structures, etc., as well as those conditions for the innovation to sort of flourish from the bottom up as well. And I think trying to think about it in that ecosystem is one of the big questions that I know Jason tries to explore with, you know, how progress happens and sort of what we're trying to explore here today. But Andrew, please jump in as well.
Sure, yeah. So yeah, I mean, I'll check my bias here, right? Like my initial reaction is like, no, I totally disagree. But like, if I'm going to steel man the position, I guess the extent to which there's like a symmetry between human created knowledge and like a natural evolutionary process of just like information accretion. So like genetic selection being a way that knowledge is created and compounded over time. I guess there's a sense in which you could say that it's like a force of nature. I think that when we're talking about like human progress, I'm not sure that I would agree that innovation in the domain of human behavior is inevitable at all. Like you can see the differences between societies that died out because they didn't invent quickly enough. And, you know, if you look at like Easter Island, for example, right? And I think that Deutsch specifically, he uses the term static versus dynamic societies, and he juxtaposes the two as like attitudes towards development and like institutions, whether they like squash and slap down anybody who tries to come up with something new as a heretic. I think it's sort of easy to come up with some examples of where it's not inevitable because you just have examples of it being explicitly discouraged. So I'm not sure that I would agree with the sort of inevitability argument about it. And I think the key question is just like, what kind of knowledge are we talking about here? Because like progress is driven by knowledge and like someone has to create it. Again, I think that what Jorge said, which is very true and like not to lose sight of, is knowledge is like compounding. So we stand on the shoulders of giants, right? Like the things that I know are built on what came before me and so on and so forth. So like, how do we just create those conditions? And how do we even identify which conditions are necessary if we accept the premise that we're not creating them? There's still an interesting question of like, well, where should I live then so that I can do, you know, get the best projected outcome? So those are kind of initial thoughts.
Jason, any thoughts, or should we keep going around to get others in?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a grain of truth in, you know, the notion that technological progress, at least within the context of a technological society, unfolds in a way that is certainly not under the control of any one individual, right? And to some extent, like there are forces of kind of the landscape of what is possible that are and what is obvious and what is desirable and so forth. There are kind of at some intersection of the laws of physics and kind of the laws of economics. There are things that are you know, that drive, and you know, and that's why you do see a lot of like simultaneous invention on major things, because lots of people are working on obvious challenges like light bulbs and telephones and stuff. But I think it's a mistake to then sort of end up concluding that the whole thing is like some kind of cosmic force that's just unfolding separate from the will of individuals or human beings at all. I think very clearly, you know, humans have a lot of agency in driving technology forward. And so, and all of the contrasting examples, North, South Korea, you know, West versus East in the 1800s, the entire world, you know, in the 1500s versus the entire world today, even specific sectors like, you know, computers and the internet versus nuclear power over the last 75 years or so. There are all sorts of things where there are contrasts, and progress doesn't seem to just unfold, certainly not at the same pace everywhere and in every place. So I'll leave it there.
Awesome, but thank you for joining, Jorge, and for the provocation. I think it's a great point of discussion. So I'm glad you stumbled upon us and had that contribution. Thanks. Liz, I think you.
Cool, thanks. Lots of great points circulating around. I think one thing that feels really compelling to me to say and share is like, how do you keep people engaged in progress movements when folks like women and underrepresented groups, they push for a lot of things, we make progress and then it's stymied or taken back? I think, Jason, I'd love to hear from you if there's a framework of, I know you mentioned kind of the trends of the past, but like, how is there a framework someone can just kind of keep peace with that? Like, okay, we may have lost the fight on this one, but like there's progress to be made. Or is there a formulaic view that I think as someone that wants to accomplish things and there's always something to be done in the progress movement, how do you kind of make peace with the pace at things which they move, in just, I think, a general like generational lifespan? How do you measure? I know we talked about measuring progress a lot, but like, how do you feel accomplished? How do you feel perennially optimistic about trying to be part of this movement when you may have given so much of it, but then it doesn't always reward you in the way that you give, whether it's industry or personal life, or I think in the US, a lot of women think about it in the context of reproductive rights and health in general. I think there's just so much in that space. We're innovating on all these fronts to improve health and improve technology. But when the powers that be or different forces come into play, how do you kind of maintain a progressive momentum? what have been some things that have worked in history, I guess, to keep people inspired? It's a big thought, but I feel like as the only woman in the room too, I'm sure there's others that feel this way. So I wanted to kind of see what people thought.
I just want to say, like, yeah, I think progress means different things to different people. Like women obviously have to deal with a lot of specific issues. Minorities have to deal with a lot of specific issues. So a lot of times when you mention like we're trying to get progress, those are like the things that pop into mind. But I think we have to define it like very abstractly, like I said before, and it's problem solving. So that could be, which includes basically every, any kind of problem, social problem, reproductive health problems, problems with inequality. Like, I think you have to define it like very abstractly, because otherwise, like the progress studies movement is going to be subject to like entryism, where people come in and say, what I really care about is inequality, or what I really care about is GDP growth, or all these different things. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about the progress studies movement, is defining it very abstractly. But obviously it does seem to focus a lot on like technology and like sci-fi, especially like science fiction type technology, which is probably a bias of the people involved.
I think you could liken it to some things in like AI too. Like, it's been vocalized so many times how certain groups aren't represented in AI, or certain products just don't work for people. And those studies are done, the evidence is clear, but like there hasn't been that much progress in that space. So I think for me, like, I'd love to just hear like what kind of sustains the momentum for people that are tired, or people that are contributing to this space.
I mean, for me, whenever
science fiction is a big thing for me, and I think like especially the 50s and 60s, like very optimistic science fiction, like Heinlein, Star Trek. But anyway, yeah.
I mean, for me, whenever the most inspiring and encouraging thing is just to step back and look at the long term. So, and that's why I study history. Just look at how far we've come and how much worse things used to be. And that is, I focus mostly on technology and industry, at least these days. I have not dug nearly as much into the history of moral and social progress, although that's a project I'd love to tackle in the future. But I think that even at a high level, just looking at the progress of morality in society, I think things are much better off than they were a few hundred years ago. And I think that is more obviously true, perhaps for women than for other groups. So just to take an example, I think that my impression is that the history of progress in morality and government is less monotonic and consistent.
Jason, you're breaking up a bit. I think if you want to shut off your camera for a second.
Sorry about that. I do think that the history of progress of social progress is less monotonic and consistent than in, say, scientific or technological progress. And so maybe there are more setbacks, but we still do make progress. And I think if you look at the big picture overall, if you're going to be a woman in any Western society today, you'd much rather be it today than in 1800 or 1700 or something, right? Or even 1900. I think that stepping back and looking at the big picture is a way to kind of remain at least prescriptively optimistic, if not descriptively optimistic.
Excellent. So maybe some others will chime in towards the end, but Tanner, don't want to make sure we've missed you.
In 1999, Pew asked a survey of Americans what they thought about the future, the new millennium that was about to come, and also what they thought about the century that had just passed. the American people were overwhelmingly optimistic. It was something like 85% believe that the next century was going to be even better than the one that came before. And it's very interesting to look at like why they said this, because if you ask them specifically in this poll, they asked them, "Well, do you think that about politics?" And no one said yes. Everyone thought politics was just going to get worse in the 20th century. No one had any belief in that. And then lots of other things. I mean, for example, I'm looking at the poll right now. Legalized abortion, 42% thought the country was worse off. 34% thought it was better off because of that. All kinds of things that were political issues at the time, like, were kind of a wash. But when they asked people, okay, then like, why will the future be better? The answers they gave were pretty clear. We're going to go to Mars, they said. We're going to cure cancer. We're going to cure AIDS. When you asked them why was the 20th century, what was the big accomplishments of the 20th century, they said the moon landing. A supermajority of Americans said it was the most important accomplishment of the 20th century. And then they list other things: birth control pills, television, airline travel, highway systems, computers, automobiles, nuclear energy, space exploration. I'm just reading off the list of things that had, 70% or higher. I bring this up because I feel like a lot of the politics culture stuff is actually downstream. I say this as somebody whose main gig is like writing about politics and culture. This whole managerial thing that Mark Andreessen's on, like, I was there 6-7 years earlier. He's copying the essay that I wrote about it without giving me credit, frankly. But I don't actually think that's the big driver. If you go to China, and I have many times, I lived there for quite a while, and you talk to people, they don't believe in progress or science or technology because the government has a propaganda system that tells them they must. They believe it because if you're a 65-year-old man, you have seen every aspect of your material reality change. You grew up in a small town with pigs. You now live in a glimmering city of skyscrapers and high-speed rail. Every 5 years, a Chinese city looks completely different, tore down, built up from the beginning. If this is the reality in which you live, a reality in which the fundamental materials of your daily life are constantly changing, improving, transforming, of course you'll believe that technology has the capacity to change the future. Americans haven't experienced that for a long time. But the flip side of that is that the things that the Chinese are experiencing this through are things that we did ourselves a long time ago. Pressurized concrete and rebarb steel, like that was inventions of the late 1800s through like 1930, the techniques that are transforming China. Electrification, most of the stuff that the Chinese are experiencing are the same things that America experienced in the early 20th century. It's a very small suite of inventions. And so my feeling is that I don't know if we can have that same list of inventions again. It might have been like a historical one-shot where we were just very lucky to come up with a set of inventions, energy sources, physical materials, and modes of transportation that totally transformed human life. And I doubt that unless we can come up with transformations equally impactful, and by that, I mostly mean either new sources of energy, new ways to move things, or new things to build stuff with. Like those are the main three things. Unless we come up with transformations equal to diesel engines and steel beams, I don't know if we have a return to the kind of cultural optimism or cultural progress that was predicated on like day-to-day life-changing experiences that came from implementing those into our society, the way that China's doing today, and that most of the West did, I mean, really a century ago. Yeah, so that's my spiel. Thanks for my TED Talk.
What about this? What about the phone? There's a huge difference. We have the whole of like the internet at our fingertips. What do you think?
I mean, it isn't, right? I think the internet's impact on human life is highly overblown. I think what the internet has done, not necessarily, information technology allows us to be more efficient, but it doesn't allow us to do fundamentally new things. There are some exceptions to that. But I think by and large, what we get out of the information and like revolution is basically efficiency. And the problem with the whole Silicon Valley mindset, and frankly, a lot of economist mindset for the last 40 years, we've understood economic growth as a function of growing efficiency, as opposed to the actual physical changes that we as physical beings make in the environment around us, energy flows and stuff.
So is this your version of A Time to Build? Sorry, or does it go the other way around with Mark Andreessen as well? It's a good, I mean, I think this is a great provocation as well, because I do think, I mean, this goes back to sort of Jason and sort of the low-hanging fruit at the beginning as well, which he's done a lot of thinking about. And do we actually get those wide paradigm shifts in society today? I think you're right to, I think energy would definitely be one. I do think health, if we actually do, longevity, if we could say an extra 20, 30 years of life, whatever, you can sort of, some of these go for immortality, but I don't think we're obviously anywhere near that in actual functional terms. But I think that would be a huge shift. And I do think material science is possibly significant as well. And I mean, this is a bit of a provocation. I mean, I know we talked about 3D printing quite a lot, but if you are getting to the point of, say, synthetic, materials, biochemicals, 3D printing, which completely changes construction costs, that's also, again, a huge social shift, I would argue. But I take your point. But Jason, you've done a lot of thinking on this.
Yeah, couple of quick comments. One, I think that when you look at when I look at the innovations of the last, say, 50, 70 years versus the innovations that came in the decades prior, what I see is the difference is not the quality, like, oh, we innovated on bits recently, and before that we innovated on atoms, and bits are qualitatively different from atoms or something. I think that the internet revolution is just as important and significant as, say, the internal combustion engine or something like that. The difference that I see is that there were just more such revolutions going on in the late 19th and early 20th century. So the late 19th and early 20th century had the equivalent of computers and the internet. They had the telephone and the radio. But then on top of that, they also had, so they had a revolution in communications that was sort of the equivalent of the internet. But then they also had revolutions in energy and manufacturing and transportation and so on and so forth, right? And we've only had bits recently, right? They actually had bits back then too. They didn't call them bits because Shannon hadn't been around yet to invent the term, right? But they had the information revolution, and that was a huge deal for them as well, just as it's a huge deal for us. So I think it's not that somehow the internet is like qualitatively less important than energy and manufacturing and stuff. It's just that we need all of those things, and we used to have across the board progress in every area, and now it's been cut off in certain areas, and the internet stands out because it's the only one where progress is still going. The other thing I would say is that I agree with Tanner. There's a huge influence of just, recent history on like people's views of progress. But I do think it goes the other way around as well. I think it's a reciprocal relationship. Francis Bacon was not looking back at a generation of economic progress before him.
Cutting out again, Jason.
Sorry, I'll cut out my video again. So I do think that there's a reciprocal relationship between ideas of progress and actual progress. Francis Bacon was not looking back at a generation of, economic progress before him and saying that this is why I'm optimistic about the future. He was philosophizing from, looking at a number of examples and thinking about the fundamentals of human nature and human reason. So sometimes attitudes can change based on sort of philosophizing and reasoning, not only based on, kind of the proof. But I'll stop there. Eric's been waiting a long time, and I'd love for him to get a chance to speak.
Oh, gladly. Okay, so earlier somebody brought up the point of a lot of progress people not necessarily dealing with politics, or it's like trying to sidestep a lot of politics. And I've been thinking about that a lot because I kind of take part in the movement, and a big part of what I think drives what I choose to work on and not work on is my classic Midwestern American aversion to dealing with politicians unless I kind of absolutely have to. And I've been sitting down and thinking, like, there are people who do more political stuff, and I think it does conform to what Jason said, where a lot of the people who do the more political stuff kind of rise above the day-to-day. And as I've been thinking, it seems like a lot of us deal with the political system, like we all have a certain skepticism about the US government's ability to do certain things, but we more or less all deal with it to the extent we need to, depending on the problems we pick. So, and maybe that's wrong. I'd love to hear your all's thoughts on this. So I think of like IFP, I forget if it's Caleb or Alec, who just constantly tweets about like high skill immigration, like trying to take, it is a pretty polar. As like for my work where I don't really deal with the government ever, there is sort of I understand the constraints of the system, and I think the government should be willing to experiment with how they incentivize scientists, how they grant grants. Yeah. The political theory sense, I sort of understand the constraints of the system and that they probably won't do that on their own, but that the NIH, the NSF will fund a winner. Like they historically do that, and that's a thing they're great at, is they will find a winner and then throw more money on top of it. So I see the point of my work as trying to go find different areas to highlight what winners are or create some winners, because I don't think they're going to do the experimentation stage a lot of the time. But I think that if something does sort of pass burden of proof, they will be happy to throw more money on it and make themselves look good in that way. But I feel like that's a classic case in the movement of I think a lot of us do acknowledge what the government will and won't do and deal with it in that way. But we maybe have a skepticism of them to be able to handle the full stack. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Jason. That was kind of how I was thinking about it as the point was brought up today.
We're almost out of time, so maybe I'll just let the last couple folks give some comments. Shall we move on to Peter?
Thanks. Yeah, just sort of closing thought. It's like, it feels like a big question that's been floating around here. It's just like, where did all the tech optimism go? I'll give you two quick factors. One would be the downsides became more salient, like nuclear weapons, environmental worries. World War II felt kind of out of control, so we're going to lose control of these destructive capabilities. And then two, it'd be like upsides no longer salient. A bit like what Tara was saying, there's like a sort of material stagnation and people notice things are not changing that much. Maybe there's lack of political leadership, not enough inspiring entrepreneurs, whatever. And so, I don't know, are those two factors, like, what is that the way to sort of summarize like the explanation of like where it all went? And then if yes, then it's like that presents a pretty obvious like program for trying to get it back. You want like a solid plan for managing downside risks and make that really widely known, allay the legitimate concerns, and then just like, yeah, more visionaries, more actual progress, and like more understanding that this progress is gonna help people.
I think it's certainly a good framework to think about kind of, yeah, progress as maybe a cost benefit trade-off or something, and both looking at both the upsides and the downsides and how people perceive that. I think there is still that only peels off kind of like one layer of the onion. Like it leaves just another core of questions, which is, why did those ideas change? So yes, so historical events showed some of the problems of progress. The world wars were a huge, I think, were the central kind of event in the turning point of attitudes towards progress. But I think that the interpretation of progress is therefore something that's just inevitably going to lead to war and destruction was contingent. I think you could have had a more constructive and still sort of optimistic, or at least you could have had a response that was less fatalistic and still somehow believed in human agency to recover from the wars, to regroup, to improve our social system so that this doesn't happen again. And we're out of time, so I'll just say, I think that is not what we got in the 20th century. I think we got a different set of explanations, a different set of ideas that were highly contingent and that led us in the wrong direction. And part of what we need to do is diagnose what went wrong, both with the technocracy that arose in the mid 20th century and with the countercultural reaction to it, and then figure out what is a better way forward and what's the answer that we should have had to those problems. Similarly, I don't think there's any reason why we should have stopped seeing potential for great, amazing things to come from technology in the future. There are plenty of such things that people thought were going to come and haven't even arrived. So, where is my flying car after all? So I think that's like a much easier thing to solve. But the question of the downsides of technology and progress and how we deal with them is an important one that needs new and better answers.
Cool. I think we're at time and Liz has jumped. Sorry, Jorge, that we can come to one last point. But I think there's probably a rich theme of points and further questions. And if anyone wants to follow up the discussion, I think there's probably a lot to still chew over. So feel free to get in contact via Twitter or however. I can also send around some email details. Otherwise, incredibly grateful for everyone's contributions today. I think, yeah. And thank you, Jason, for sort of taking the time to go through everything. I think we'll probably speak to everyone here in future multiple other forums as well.
Yeah, thanks to you, and thanks to the Institute for hosting. And this has been it's been a great chat. Thanks to everybody for coming.
Take care.
So long, everyone.